Welcome back. If you have friends that are still in the atrium, you can tell them to come, that this is going to be the best session of the day. I say this at every session, but it keeps being true, which is statistically impossible. But anyways, welcome again in the Blue Theater. I swear they've written cards for me that are a lot more logical and better than what I'm saying. But we're now about to dive into a great session on what it takes to establish a behavioral insights unit, subject dear to my heart, given that's what I do as a job. We have with us a panel possessing truly global expertise in this topic, which is really very exciting, and who will be discussing just what governments and other organizations need to do in order to build support for and ensure the long-term sustainability of a BI unit. BI is Behavioral Insights, for those of you who do not know, but then if you don't know, not sure what you're doing here. To lead the discussion, I'm pleased to welcome a good friend, obviously, since we've been at BIT together for a while. Dr. Serene Koh, Dr. Serene, as they say here, is the director of BIT Singapore and was instrumental in setting up BIT Singapore in 2016. She's led projects across various policy domains, including water conservation, academic stress, which we all know about here, and youth rehabilitation. And with you as our panel, and please give them a warm welcome, because they're very subject to stage fright. We don't know. Rasha Attar, who you'll all have seen, is not subject to stage fright. It was a joke. Rasha is the director of the Behavioural Science Group and manages a broad insights portfolio. You'll have seen some of it at the conference in the atrium, and you'll have this great chance of hearing about, this time, the construction of the Behavioural Science Group and this unit within the Office of Development Affairs in the UAE. For the past 2 years, Rasha spearheaded the growth and expansion of the BSG, consistently delivering impactful behavioral projects in collaboration with a range of strategic partners. Then you'll hear from Professor Ivan Fernando Budassi. So Professor Budassi is the former director of the Behavioral Sciences and Public Policies Unit in Argentina's Ministry of Economy. He's a lawyer by trade, and then led the establishment of the first nudge unit in Argentina, where he also led multiple projects across topics spanning vaccination, tax, education, organ donation, and energy. So you're starting to see that they all have a very wide range of expertise. Then we'll hear from Faisal Naru, who is the founder and director of Think, Test, Do, working with leaders and executives to innovate services and solutions for the organizations. He's, as the inaugural executive director of the Policy Innovation Center, the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, he set up Africa's first national level behavioral unit. Faisal founded the work also at the OECD on behavioral insights, including setting up an internal behavioral team that was working on applying BI to the organization itself. So I'm done with these very long introductions, but that show you the breadth of expertise and experience that this panel brings together. Thank you all for being willing to share these insights, and with this, I'll hand over to you, Serene.
Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. I'm going to not apologize in advance because we've all decided to keep this conversation quite loose, quite light. I have a set of questions, but I also have a very unruly panel who have requested to be able to talk with, but actually really over each other. So I'm going to start with some questions, and then we're just going to see where it goes from here. So I ask if it starts to get a bit noisy. We promise we will not dance, although Faisal has said that he would like to. All right, anyway, my first question actually is to Faisal. So as we all know, Faisal has had a lot of experience mapping of BI units across the world. And so I think the audience would like very much to know what you would say are some of the key considerations for successfully establishing a BI unit. And that's what we're all here for.
Okay, thank you very much, Serene. Of course, it's a pleasure to be here to speak to all of you. I think as always, I prepare something, and then I come to the conference and I rip it up and decide to just freestyle, if you like, instead, because of the various conversations going on. So look, I'd say, the strapline there really is that, look, in 2017, there were about 200 behavioral insights public policy bodies across the world. In 2025, it's now 631, to be exact, and it's growing. So the overall picture there sounds good, and it is good. However, and I'm sure Ivan, we'll hear from you, is that the picture actually is a bit more nuanced than that. And I think this is something that has been spoken about in the corridors here, which is that, yes, I think we all understand that it's needed. It's beyond the stage of it being a new thing. It's not a fad anymore, which is great. But different bodies are struggling, and they're struggling for a variety of different reasons. And the way that I characterize it is that there's a strategy issue there, which is that for some, they kind of have started off in introducing it as a silver bullet. That it's going to fix everything in a short amount of time, and you're going to be able to have huge returns on a relatively small investment. That leads to too many problems.
Yep.
And instead, I think what we've been working on is that what you'd rather need to have is a strategy of trying to find golden nuggets. That the purpose of what you're trying to do here is that you're trying to find pieces of information, data, solutions, which are going to inform decision-making. And that might mean a failed experiment. But it's not a failed experiment. You've just found out not to roll out something that you would have done so on an entire population and would have backfired or not worked. So there's that paradigm shift that I think is needed. And like I said, you know, the script that I was going to come with was going to direct you towards the paper that was written and blah, 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 whatever, but you can search that and read that in your own time. But I think for the conversations that are happening right now, I think it's probably more important, I think, to speak about that and open up that dialogue instead.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this really, you know, when we talk to teams about these things, the risk of over-promising is so real, right? And especially when it's something that's so exciting, it's so interesting. And I really like what you said about just these little nuggets. It could be, you know, a data point, it could be a piece of evidence, and very often it can sometimes be just the low-hanging fruit. It doesn't seem like super exciting, but that really is the entry point you need. And so my next question is actually to Rasha, which is, you know, what are these like low-hanging fruit, these early win projects that have given us that entry point that Faisal was talking about, you know, and how has that been effective in building the capability? What is that seed that has worked for you?
At the Behavioral Science Group at the Office of Development Affairs, we've been very fortunate to have some great partners from the very, very early beginning that helped us achieve these early wins as a new government behavioral science unit. And one of these partners is NAMA, who we've partnered with for this conference, the National Food Loss and Waste Initiative, who've been mandated to decrease food waste by 50% by 2030. As I'm sure most of you know, the UAE has a very generous culture of hospitality, and with that comes food waste. And we believe that food waste is inherently a behavioral challenge. It's a sum of individual decisions that we make on a daily basis. And so together with NAMA, we said, you know, let's scratch our heads and how can we put something forward that people can see? And what we ended up doing is we ran a series of nudges across 5 different hotels during the holy month of Ramadan. Usually when we fast, when we're breaking our fast and we're starving, we tend to eat with our eyes. So we pile food on our plates, often knowing that we're not going to get through all this food. So what we did together said, let's run this month-long trial across 5 hotel iftar buffets, where we rolled out very simple, low-cost, low-tech nudges. And these were smaller plates. We've seen this around the world. Messages, behaviorally informed messages, informing diners of food waste, and pledges, pledge cards, to encourage diners to pledge that they will not waste food. And these nudges, the results were very promising. We were able to decrease plated food waste by up to 15%. And these were tangible results, right? And then upon the completion of this trial, we were then asked to scale it up nationally. And it was such a delight to roll it up across the whole country, where we had 220 partners across different sites join in implementing these nudges over a 5-week period, where we decreased food waste by 15.2 tons. And that started getting the attention of a lot of future partners, saying, how can behavioral science help me achieve my mandate? And that was great, right? NAMA has used behavioral science from the very beginning, and they continue to do so in all their work. And so basically, to sum up, I think it's very important to identify policy areas that constitute low-hanging fruits, for challenges that are inherently behavioral, but also identifying partners, good partners that see eye to eye, that believe in behavioral science and see how it can help achieve their targets and their mandate.
Right. I think having partners is so important because, like what Faisal said, you need to have that seed and be able to have a partner who's visionary enough to be able to see the life cycle
Absolutely.
from beginning to end, right? And it's not just this one single win, but it's about how a low-hanging fruit, that first seed, can then grow into this very much larger, much more sustainable project across time. And having a partner really just leads us into this next consideration, which is where I'm going to pick Yvonne's brain, on organizational considerations when we're thinking about building BI units. So for those of us in the audience who are really interested in thinking about where in an organization is it best to plant this behavioral unit, I want to ask Yvonne, when you were establishing the Argentina's behavioral unit within the Cabinet Office, what were your greatest challenges related to organizational placement, right? And how is it that you overcame it? Because it's such an important decision.
Well, first of all, let me apologize for my Tarzan-style English, because you and our hosts have such a good command of English, so I'm ashamed speaking in front of you, and especially with our co-speaker that has set the world record in counting behavioral units. So the Guinness is for him, counting and organizing behavioral units. So, but addressing your question, we were speaking before this encounter about what's Latin America in behavioral sciences, and we don't realize that we are in the exact opposite side of the world, and it's difficult for everybody and such an international crowd here to know how Latin America deals with behavioral affairs. There were lots of small or medium-scale intentions to set agencies in governments all around Latin or South America. That is the part of Latin America I'm most familiar with. But they all have their peak and their disease. So when I was offered to lead the agency by a champion, I said, well, this is a great opportunity. We have a champion that has a very important role in government. He has experience because he was a head of IBD, development affairs. He knows a lot about behavioral sciences, so we try to go by the book. And when we are speaking about the book, it's inside the NAT unit of Dr. Halpern. So we put all the boxes in place. We say, well, we have to commit the president. The president was a criminal law professor, so we search for our interesting tales about insights of behavioral experiments with criminal law. So he was on board in our first session when we inaugurate our unit. Second box, well, we try to commit and to see the other parts of the government that we are important. Not silver bullet, but we can help them. Mm-hmm. It's not that we are going to solve all problems, but we are another tool from regulation affairs within government. We have international support. Kasanse, that was my mentor 20 years ago, came from the first stage of our organization. Dr. Halpern also helped us with the BAT. And perhaps with a very naive view, they say, well, we are going to change things, and we can see the survival of the unit in the future. We have very good partners. For example, in the health sector, they are used to RCTs and to test before working. Laura was here. We have another part of the government that were not so keen on working with us. The educational environment was not very welcoming of testing and then applying large-scale policies. But we thought that we have our unit in place. Mid-term elections, cabinet reshuffle, our champion went away of the government, he resigns, not as usual, not very happy, so he went away and said, well, sorry, my unit. And we were hanging from a thin thread. We tried to find another champion. Thanks God, we have another important people that were going to the Ministry of Economy and saved us. Saved us, it's a way of seeing things, because when my wife is here, I was 7 months without having my salary and my post. I have to sell to make a Faustian pact with the Ministry of Economy, because I said, well, I let you have your unit, but you have to let all these 60 lawyers within the ministry. So we were struggling until the end of government to survive and to continue our projects. And then the last bullet, not the silver bullet, was the changing of government. In this polarized world, we were thinking and we were working with the opposition parties in order to assure the continuance of our office. But Black Swan came, people that nobody expects came to be the president, came with the chainsaw. He was the inventor of the chainsaw as a Trump-style government, and our unit was cut away. So, in a second stage of our talking, we can think what we've done badly, what can we do in the future to assure the continuance of our projects in Latin America. But going back the book, that's my experience. That's assure that you have a surviving office of our beloved behavioral insight units.
If I can just add on, I think maybe kind of drawing out, I think, some of the lessons which are similar in other parts and probably quite important for the region as well, which is, and Rasha, you kind of mentioned this as well, which is the importance of building an ecosystem, that you can't be operating by yourself in a silo, and that's inside the organization and outside of the organization. And I think that that's been one of the key success factors, is having that ecosystem, and in often cases you have to nurture them. And congratulations to BX 2025, because that's exactly what this is doing. So hopefully you all can not listen to us as much, but maybe speak to each other a lot more would be good. I think the second thing is around when you are conducting this kind of work, that you have to understand that you are in the world of politics and you are in the world of policy making, and there's an art to that. And part of that art means that, yes, you are raising the rigor in terms of science, but at the same time, you are being scientific. But the word that I use, which is that evidence without a narrative are just numbers with no meaning. And so often, again, what units fall into the trap of is they run an experiment. They say, this is the evidence. Dana, fantastic. And the leader turns around to them and goes, well, so what?
Yep.
What does this mean? What does this mean for policy? What does this mean for our organization?
Absolutely.
And so building the narrative is incredibly important. And the last point that I want to make, and this, particularly again goes back to Ivan's experience and some of the points, which is that culture is king. And you really have to understand the local cultural context and have it locally driven. So for instance, when I was doing the work, and I hope my Nigerian brother and sister are in the audience here, but part of the story of having the Policy Innovation Center in Nigeria was that from the start, I had to step away, and it had to be Nigerian-led. And in a similar way in the region, I would say that when you are doing these kind of things, you have to build in from the start that local transfer of knowledge, expertise, and ultimately leadership, because, and I'm doing work in other places around, like Singapore, Malaysia, etc. It has to be Malaysian, it has to be Singaporean, it has to be Emirati, it has to be locally understood so that you can get it into the system. And I think that's kind of some of the very interesting, parts of this as well.
Rasha? If I may add, I think you hit the nail on the head with the phrase building an ecosystem. And I think that's implicitly one of the core pillars of our mandate, is to not only provide advisory or capability building or running trials or thought leadership, but rather building an ecosystem. We want everyone around us in the government to speak the same language, to understand the benefits of this toolkit, to see with the behavioral lens. And I think over the past 2 years, we've seen such a great shift in people starting to really speak our language, right? They understand. They've seen, they've seen tangible impact. They've seen change, and it's just great that we have more people now not believing but actually implementing behavioral science, whether in the organization or across.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, we're using the metaphor of an ecosystem a lot, but I think it literally is one, right? And what do we think of when we think of an ecosystem? Is we think of, it's complex, right? It shifts all the time. The environment is not stable. You need to make sure that you have things which grow and thrive. And if you want an ecosystem to thrive, you can't be the only person who is in it. Right? You need the partners, and I think I really like what you said about making sure that it is the local and the context and the culture which takes center stage. Because if we truly want behavioral science as a field to grow, to have roots, and to be sustainable, you can't put yourself. You need to put the context at the center. And so many of the sessions that we've had so far have really been about how do we adapt the evidence to the context, be very sensitive to the context and the culture, in order for us that when we leave, it remains growing on its own. And I think that's really so important. And on that note, and I'm going to put Rasha on the spot again, for an ecosystem to thrive, we really need to, sorry to belabor the metaphor, but the people who are in this ecosystem, the people to help grow it, and we've talked about this a lot, and Rasha and I are really good friends, which is how do we make sure that the people who we hire into the organizations, how do you balance sort of this specialized expertise in behavioral science with the importance of having people who understand government policy? So if we really wanted the policy domain, do we pick someone who is very aware of like employment or climate, or do you pick somebody who has like a behavioral science background? And how do you manage the tension, and how do you think about that from an organizational perspective?
Absolutely. So let me take a step back. Behavioral science as a discipline, as a field, started in the English-speaking world. And as a consequence of that, much of the expertise is still and remains concentrated in those countries, whether the US, the UK, Australia. And UAE is very different on many levels to these countries. And so importing expertise or behavioral science expertise to just run interventions locally is very likely to not work. Context is key. And the model that we have adopted, I wouldn't say it's the perfect model or it's the winning model, but it's what has worked really well for us so far, is what I'd call a mixed staffing approach. And that's where we bring in international expertise in behavioral science and marry that with local understanding, local expertise in policy making, local understanding of cultural nuances, cultural sensitivities. How do policies work? How are policies created? And I think that marriage of international with local has been vital over the past 2 years. Now, is this the right model? Is this the model that we will continue to embody? Maybe not. And I think in the long run, and as we develop more homegrown capacity and local expertise in behavioral science, which is something we're working very closely with our partners, CBID, here at NYUAD, I think our reliance on international behavioral science expertise will become gradually less and less.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder if either Faisal or Yvonne have anything to say in terms of staffing.
Let me speak about the context that you say. Well, in Latin America, especially in South America, on the one hand, we have one thing that after the 80s, we have not more military coups, we have a very stable democracies. In all each country, few exceptions in the whole area. But on the other hand, the only stable things in our government is change. You change within governments, cabinet reshuffles, as I told you. We change governments, and we have these polarized attitudes that we never thought we were going to have in our mature democracies, and in Argentina, 40 years of stable democracy. So the other thing is that when we have a kind of spoiled system as the US in the 19th century, or first decades of the 20th century, that our civil service is also changing at the middle level. So when you engage with working with somebody, he knows that perhaps he's not going to be there in the 2, 3, or 4 years that our projects have to endure to see their fruits. So what we see that is not changing that fast are the multilateral organizations. So what we were thinking about in one experience that we have of our failure, I can say, of the survival of our agency, is that we can ask to the multilateral organization to put our one default rules in all the project that runs in our countries. Because you have Guterres, the Secretary General in the United Nations, that say, well, one of the 5 things that are going to change the world, one of it is behavioral science. He addressed everybody, but when you go to the field level, we have, for example, we have running a project of near $1 billion for trains, and we speak with the managers, and they don't have any idea what behavioral sciences are. So perhaps if we can add another box to tick, aside that gender equality matters that they have to contemplate in every project, perhaps as this has a stable, a permanence in the structure of that project, perhaps we can make our policies with behavioral insights to continue in this ever-changing panorama. So perhaps we can, in this international audience, to think about how we can use a typical Sunstein default rule in order to improve our stability, knowing that nothing is stable, not only in our not less developed country, but as we see in more developed countries, también there are shifts and turns that were unexpected to, at least to myself. So that's the point I wanted to make.
I think, look, of course, I agree with everything you said, but I think that really you do have to really think carefully about how you're staffing and think about the functions that you want to have. And again, that goes back to that strategy side of it, which is that if you're going to be looking for certain functions of embedding this inside your institutional organization, then you need people that understand the institution and organization. It's a bit like a donor transplant. If you get somebody who doesn't quite understand or can't fit, the body rejects it. And it's the same like in an organization. So you need to have that. And in a similar way, you need to have that competence of the culture, and you need to understand all of those things as well. So I think all of that is very important. I think the other important part here is that you kind of have to be behavioral yourself, and you have to apply it to yourself. So you're not there to apply the lessons and all of the various different techniques of behavioral science on other people. Overconfidence bias being one, on everybody else. You have to actually apply it to your own institution and organization and unit itself. So when you are communicating, you can't start off with assumptions. So when you are trying to convince people of certain things, you have to check your own information and evidence in the first instance. So being a successful behavioral unit is being behavioral for real. And that means being yourself, applying the techniques to yourself. So unfortunately, what that means, and this isn't always great, is that you always start off with any question that comes to you, the answer that you always give is, I don't know.
Depends.
I don't know, or it depends, but I know how to find out. And that's kind of the key motto and ethos for kind of those behavioral units that have been successful in there, which is hard for some because you're told to come up with the answer straight away. And that's a difficult thing to manage.
Yeah. I think it's also, again, back to what you said earlier about not over-promising, there is a profound sense of humility that comes with doing research, right? Especially, we're in the business of evidence generation, and I think as a group, we've had this conversation before, that failing is itself knowledge. Yes, right? Because I think the worst thing that you want to do is to go out and do something that could have created harm, but you hadn't done anything to prevent it. Yeah. And so I think very often the paradigm that we have is only positive results are good, but it is this long struggle for us to talk to senior management and talk to policymakers to say, sometimes when we see a backfire or we see a non-effect, that itself is evidence, right? So that it does work. And that humility is so important for behavioral teams to just go into. And when organizations are hoping to build these teams to be able to have that conversation. It is a difficult conversation, right? I think that it's very hard to tell bosses, look, we are okay to fail. But if you don't have that conversation early enough, I think you're setting yourself up for a hard journey. And I think a lot of, I'm sure you have experience with teams that struggle with that. And I just wonder whether or not that's something that you think a lot about.
Yes, but the thing is that perhaps you yourself and your colleagues in the unit are prepared to fail. But the problem is when you present your project to the politician, they don't like to see their failure or our failure, that at the same time is their failure, in numbers. So collecting data to analyze, to give evidence, it's both-sided always. So that's the problem, because everywhere, we spoke about Singapore, that also has its own struggle of power, like every government. It's difficult to put forward when you fail. So perhaps a traditional regulation measure that goes with all the infantry of government, and you seem that you are doing something, well, who knows if it worked or not, but you appear to be doing something, not our small-scale projects, and in order then to amplify its effects. So it's difficult to change this idea of government. So you always find very good partners in certain areas, and in other areas, they are not so keen in seeing the numbers and the possibility of failure to be exposed.
I think, I mean, a quick example for everybody, I think, that demonstrates this quite well, is the work that happened in Australia on blind recruitment in the civil service, right? Which is that where, the idea is that want to improve diversity inside the civil service, so we're going to blind the CVs in the application process, et cetera, so that then you get better decision making and you reduce bias. The result was actually it didn't, and it did the opposite, right? Now, what does that mean? And this is the whole part about finding the narrative and the golden nugget. What that means is that the sifting process in the recruitment was working fine. The problem is with the assessment. And this is the same thing with lots of other civil services. I came from the UK government, UK civil service. I worked on this as well. It was the same issue. The issue was that, particularly in the UK civil service back then, I'm quite old, was that ultimately you got a good selection of candidates coming forward, but there were 3 middle-aged white men, all from the same university, sitting behind a desk and then deciding on which one they're going to pick. That's the problem if you want to deal with diversity and recruitment, not the sifting, which is the golden nugget. And that's the point, right, about you need to be ready to be able to understand what the results are going to be, whether it's expected or it's not expected. And I think that's kind of, a great example to demonstrate to you about how you need to do things. I think the other thing that I'd say is that I do kind of advocate for units working with the decision makers and the politicians a lot more. And I think preparing them a lot more for a lot of the work that's going to come about, because of what they might be expecting is a quick fix or to avoid the big problem. But in actual fact, there's the bigger issue which they're going to have to face at some point, or they are subject to bias, but they don't understand. And a quick example again, just on that. So work just out from Ireland on attitudes towards climate change. Lots of very interesting things. Probably the most interesting thing from a political perspective is the fact that out of all of the people that they surveyed, only 10% of people, if you like, were climate deniers. Okay, only 10%, actually less than 10%. The issue, though, is that when politicians are making decisions, they have an assumption that it's 50-50. So they don't have the courage to go ahead and have climate policies, even though people are willing to take the climate policies. Sometimes people are willing to pay. So again, when Scotland was doing water prices, experiments showed that people are happy to pay one-off payment, a large payment, in order to fix the water system. Politicians are like, well, I can't do that. We'll do a drip price. A drip price means you never fix the problem. So there's all of this kind of work that needs to happen, that you're trying to de-bias decision-making ultimately. And how you do that using all of the golden nuggets that you're producing is one of the factors and considerations that you have to have.
Yeah. I think the other thing that, which to your point, very often people think of behavioral insights teams as solution generators. And they think that it's that sexy sort of like intervention that you should promise. But I think they forget that it is also in the identification and diagnosis of a problem, which is really contributes to the solution. You cannot design a good solution if you don't understand the problem. And so much of what you've talked about, actually, these golden nuggets and these insights are really telling you where you have to fix a problem before you try to fix a problem. And so I think, again, in the setting up of a behavioral insights team, think about your function as being really quite holistic, right? It isn't just, I'm here, I'm going to swoop in, I'm going to like create this like shiny intervention for you. It really is actually to try to understand where is your problem in this entire journey, right? Are we even making the right assumptions about things? Are we identifying the right things? And so it is as much a diagnostic tool as it is a problem-solving tool. Or you may even say that it is in its diagnosis that it helps the problem solving. You cannot sort of like divorce them as separate functions.
I mean, I would argue that, in fact, it being used in the diagnosis is probably the most important part. And it might lead to a behavioral intervention, but it might not. And that's absolutely fine. But you're trying to find out why are people behaving the way that they're behaving and checking all of your assumptions about why that is. And so that diagnosis part is like, you know, gold.
Yeah, but the thing is, I was thinking, well, first, when you were speaking about the English, the British civil service, I was always thinking when we went out of our unit, of the government, is, well, which are the institutional safeguards? Because the thing is that we relied upon too much to the champions, and when the champions went away, what happened with the unit of behavioral insights? So I've been reading a lot about the British civil service, and it says in the 19th century, even for clerkship works, they asked for Greek and Latin abilities, so it might be a bit elitist, the selection processes. So how can we think in processes to change this environment in our countries? And we have another, I want to give an example as well. The BIT worked with the Uruguayan government in a project that's called Ceibal. That the thing is that it's separate from the traditional bureaucracy of the government, and they have stability. So they could work in absenteeism in school absentees for several years, and they obtain very good results. On the other hand, the World Bank has a one-off intervention in the Ministry of Education in Peru. And if you ask not only the population, if you go to the Ministry of Education in Peru, never even reminds that things that was so interesting, a great project, happened. So that's why I was obsessed about this changing in procedures, in default rules, or something like that, that can provide the stability that in general, we don't have in Latin America.
Which brings me to my next question to Faisal, which is about new technologies and the confluence of new technologies and what we expect of people that we hire into these behavior units. And so, we've been talking a lot about AI in many of the sessions yesterday and even today. And, as BI units focus on incorporating these tools, do you think that it should be a distinct sort of like thing which we try to inculcate, or should we just focus really on behavioral change and then if the AI helps, it helps. If not, So I guess my bigger question would be, to what extent do you see emerging technologies like AI influence the way in which people either recruit or organize BI units?
So I think Rasha had, in the great presentation just earlier on with Barbara and with Fatima, was kind of showing where some of this is going. And clearly there needs to be skill sets that are going to enable the use of these new technologies, which can be hugely useful, whether it's in terms of testing and pre-testing and having kind of all of those synthetic samples in order to do. I would say that it's something that we have to accept is happening, and I think it's something that we have to embrace. And I think the units also have to embrace them and use them. But I'd be interested in how many people have tried to use it for any of the behavioral work that they've done. I must admit, I tested it, and at the moment, I couldn't find as much use of it as say, for instance, you might want. But I would say that if it's there as a research assistant for you, if it's there in terms of the complex, like modeling stuff that you're doing, Rasha, that is 100% going to be there. So I think we have to embrace these new technologies, and we have to recruit people that understand them and can start to use them, because they're only going to accelerate the way that we work. Because, like you said in the last session, Rasha, you can't wait to have all of these sample sizes, recruitment of samples, and then do all the testing, et cetera, all the time, and not for every single policy. So we do have to use these, but we just have to have the right guardrails and kind of understand the caveats about the fact that where there are the limitations of them, and where then we can then take that towards a field trial when it's necessary, but not always.
Rasha?
I just wanted to build on your point on using AI for rapid research, but also to touch back on your previous point about diagnostics and how themselves the learnings are in fact useful, or insights in better understanding what your challenge is. So at the behavioral science group, we use a tests framework, and we try to we do it very collaboratively with our partners, and we do it hand in hand, so that we're building capacity while we're working on the project. So after we've kind of honed in and targeted exactly the behavior that we're trying to target, we spend a lot of time in the explore phase, and that is intentional for us to show our partners, for us to both better understand the problem that we have, but also in the insights that we do derive through all the research, quant, qual, ethnographic, whatever it is, these learnings in themselves are huge. So these themselves could be great. We could stop there. Now, whether we continue to designing a solution, trialing it, testing it, that's a plus, right?
Yeah.
But it shouldn't always be the expectation that you're going to run a trial and you're going to get effect. And that's what we try to do in that early phases. We're already learning so much more about our current problem. And whether, how we take it forward, that's a separate story. The learnings in themselves are such great and valuable insights that could be used for various different reasons.
100%.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're running out of time, I'm very conscious. I'm going to leave the last question for Ivan, but actually I'm also going to get Faisal to respond to it, given your experience across the world. And so, you talked a little bit just now about sort of the changes that the government underwent and how the only constant is change in Argentina. And so how can behavioral science units build legitimacy and institutional resilience to make sure that it survives these political transitions, particularly in a very polarized and unstable context? I mean, it could be political, but I think it could also be, governmental. It could be organizational. I mean, not everybody here works specifically in government, but organizations go through upheavals all the time. And so, how do you build legitimacy, credibility, and resilience in the face of such rapid change?
Yeah, that's a great question, because Faisal was telling that the problem that sometimes we turn too academic, because we have always one foot in the academia and the other in the field. So in the whole context of these conferences that we were attending, I think below the surface is a quite intellectual debate about boosts, nudges, and these niceties or German precision about definitions. I think in our context, not only in Argentina, but in Latin America, nudges are alive and kicking, and very useful to demonstrate how useful we can be. Being humble, as always said, that, we have not the silver bullet, we are a kind of complementation of the traditional regulation tools. But the legitimacy can be achieved with the quick fix that we can make, the low-hanging fruits, and all our traditional initial tools, well established by, now it seems to be the prehistory of behavioral sciences by Halpern or Sunstein or Thaler, but they are still useful for our work, and when you try to convince bureaucracy and politicians that the usefulness of our tools. And on the other hand, we try to be imaginative in order to survive to these strong tides. But the thing is, perhaps it's a way to comfort oneself that when you see what happened in the US with the USA agency and all the things that you say that, well, it will stay forever in government and there are not anymore, perhaps they can return. So in this, as you said, polarized environments, we have to be imaginative in order to achieve legitimacy through quick wins on the one hand, and on the other hand, to provide and to search stability when our institutions cannot achieve in a short term. We cannot ask for our civil service to know Latin and Greek in the short term. So we have to be imaginative on that and to ask the help of a multilateral organization that we rely upon many of our projects to instill behavioral science in every of them and in every work they do in our countries. It can be very useful.
Faisal, last words?
I mean, one of the things I already said, which is about the making it legitimate and localization. For instance, the fact that Russia understands here is no surprise that therefore BSG has been a success, right? So that's important. But look, I would say one sensible thing and one maybe provocative thing. Okay, so the sensible thing is remember that often for your leaders and for other people in the organization, they don't really care whether you're doing behavioral science or not. They care whether or not what you're doing is relevant and makes an impact. And you doing behavioral science for the sake of behavioral science is never going to be legitimate and it's never going to be accepted. So you have to kind of make sure that you position yourself in that way and stay relevant to what the organization's needs are. The more provocative thing, I think, is the other way around, which is we all keep mentioning about how we need to stay humble, we need to be humble. That's true. But you also have to play a bit the institutional game. And I would almost argue, and I kind of said this to a number of various different units, is that you should be a bit more demanding. And what I mean by that is that you have value to bring to the organization institution. It is a capacity which is needed, understanding why people behave the way that they behave. And therefore, you shouldn't be in a beggar's position in trying to be established or to be there. Because if we are now becoming very cost-benefit analysis style and based upon the evidence of what are you going to have for returns, some people might argue that a lot of economics teams should have been fired in 2008 when the financial crisis happened, because it was their job to watch out and to see whether that happened. They didn't, right? But why is it that behavioral science units all of a sudden have to have 100% kind of certainty in everything that they're going to do is going to have impact and do? No. I kind of say you need to switch that psychological corporate conversation around to say that behavioral science is here, it's here to stay, other people are using it, and we're about making better decisions and having better outcomes. And you need it, full stop.
Right. Wonderful. And I think this takes us to a close. Thank you all of you for being here and for indulging for friends and us chatting among ourselves. Thank you so much. And thank you all of you. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much. And I think you can now enjoy some well-deserved lunch outside. And thank you for having been in the Blue Room. This is the end of the Blue Room for today. Enjoy the rest of the conference.